Hi everybody, it's Luke McBain, today with another video on leadership. This time I'm going to comment on an interview with Beau Lotto. He's a neuroscientist and works a lot on perception and creativity, and I found his interview quite interesting. It's a short one on Big Think, so it's very condensed. I'm going to take it a little bit apart and then comment on individual sections of what he says from the neuroscientific view on creativity. He doesn't comment on leadership. That's my job. I'm the leadership expert, and I can contextualize what he says into the realm of leadership, although at one point he does do refer then slightly to leadership, and why then people who are in positions of leadership then encounter difficulties in defining the future in a new way. And it has a lot to do with this idea of stability and certainty versus uncertainty and working with the unknown. So, as you know, my subject is leadership as the art of meaning creation, and my hypothesis is that leadership is a form of art which is concerned of this transformation of the unknown into the known, and therefore create meaning, as opposed to management, which is this attempt to quantify and put things into categories and objectives and plan according to certain concepts and quantities. And we'll get into that a little bit at this point, a little bit later. So let's have a look. Just one more thing up front. I'm personally not a big fan of the word creativity. I don't know why. It seems that it has been inflated over the last decades. Everything now is creative. Just be a little bit be a little bit creative, and everything will be okay. I think the process is much more demanding. That's why I call it a process. I call it an artistic process, much more than creativity, just to emphasize that it's quite serious. It's quite a serious business, although it's play, and again shows the paradoxical nature of this, and also the challenge you would be seen, or you see yourself in, when dealing with an artistic process, or in this case with creativity. Let's have a look what Beau Lotto says in his interview with Big Think on neuroscience, creativity, and perception.
Every behavior that we do to reduce uncertainty. We do to increase certainty. When you go down below in a boat and your eyes are moving in registry of boat, and your eyes are saying, oh, we're standing still. But your inner ears are saying, no, we're moving. And your brain cannot deal with that conflict, so it gets ill.
I just had to take that short snippet because in this paradigmatic way in which he says it, everything we do to reduce uncertainty. And there is a lot of truth in that. If you consider how you plan your day, how you plan your work, what we understand of learning, of rationalization of the world, of knowing a profession, a science, and relying on other people also to do their job and reduce the uncertainty that they are doing a bad job. For example, if you're going to a doctor, you want to rely on the doctor that he or she is doing her job and can actually help you. So a reduction of uncertainty is a huge thing. And of course also in management it's a huge thing, and in politics. So, and there we are in this paradoxical state that on one hand, yes, we want to reduce uncertainty, we want to plan, we want to have a certain outcome, but that seems to reduce our ability to be creative and also our ability to actually lead properly.
The stress resulting from uncertainty is tremendous in our society. It increases brain cell death, it decreases plasticity, it makes you a more extreme version of yourself. We do almost everything to avoid uncertainty. And yet the irony is that that's the only place we can go if we're ever going to see differently.
also had to pause here because this sentence needs emphasis. We only can go to a place of uncertainty if we want to see things in a new way, or also if we want to create something new. So yes, there is that sort of quality to that point. And actually, I always say that is what leadership is all about. It is facing the unknown, that uncertain space, and dealing with this level of uncertainty and complexity and chaos. Now, I would argue that probably a lot of people are confronted nowadays already with that level of complexity and uncertainty, and are suffering from that, or experience that as extremely stressful, as Beau Lotto also points out, that this is something very stress-inducing. And again, the question is then, why aren't people who have to face that every day in those kind of jobs, why aren't they prepared better for that kind of stress? So this is a real mystery, because it's almost common knowledge. And you could even say that the inability to create meaning out of that chaotic situation is then something which causes burnout, and which causes people then to opt out of these positions and say, I don't want to deal with that anymore. Again, so we have this paradoxical state where we are looking for certainty, we would like to plan for the future, we would like to have a certain outcome, but everything which is new and which yields high risk and high rewards, and where we can create also a future and therefore also create meaning and new value, is highly uncertain and creates also stress if we're not prepared for it properly.
And that's why creativity, seeing differently, always begins in the same way. It begins with a question. It begins with not knowing. It begins with a why. It begins with a what if.
I found that also very strange. One of my slogans is always saying it always begins with not knowing. And he just also said that, and I found that strange, because I wasn't aware of his work and on his view on creativity. But that's absolutely true. If you look at any artistic process, if it's painting, sculpting, writing, all artists will say it begins with not knowing, and it begins also with a sense of dread or fear at certain times. So, which is again paradoxical, because if you're a competent person, if you have studied a certain domain, if you're a level, if you're somewhere within a hierarchy, it is expected that you project this knowingness, this competency, and can also justify your actions. That is what also people perceive then to be a good leader or a professional. And that's quite true. Like, you would like to work with a person like that who can justify their actions and explain them to you rationally. But that seems to be not always the best place to be if you are confronted with the unknown and would like to deal with it in some way. And we'll get to that point, why then persisting on this position of I know these things or have certain qualifications doesn't really prepare you then to deal with this unknown space. So on one hand, you have to seem competent. On the other hand, you have to be willing to start with not knowing or admitting that you know nothing, and confront yourself with that kind of insight.
And I should also say that these assumptions are essential for your survival. Every time you take a step, your brain has hundreds of assumptions. That the floor is not going to give way, that your legs aren't going to give way, that that's not a hole, it's a surface. Right? So these assumptions keep us alive. But they can also get in the way, because what was once useful may no longer be useful.
Yeah, and so what was once useful may not be any longer useful. And these are not just assumptions about reality as we see it, or our social environment, or our organization. these are also assumptions about ourselves. Who are we? If I perceive myself to have a certain role and a certain set of skills, and I put a lot of work in developing them to deal with the world, to produce certain outcomes, it's very, very difficult for me then to let go of the assumption that these skills and this knowledge is absolutely necessary to produce an outcome. So again, another conundrum you would find yourself in when being in leadership.
So your brain evolved to evolve. It's adapted to adapt, right? So a deep question is, how is it possible to ever see differently if everything you see is a reflex grounded in your history of assumptions?
So that's also a good paradox. How is it possible to see something differently if everything what you do is grounded in your assumptions? And of course there is ways how to do that, and if you look into how artists do it, that's what they do. They just remove themselves of those assumptions and step into a totally different space to allow themselves to view the world totally fresh and totally new, and then start working from that. Perhaps we'll get into that a little bit later.
Our assumptions and the process of vision is both our constraint and our savior at the same time, right? Because our brain evolved to take what is meaningless and make it meaningful. If you're not sure that was a predator, it was too late, right? So your brain evolved to take this meaningless data and make meaning from it, and that's the process of creating perception. And then we hold on to those assumptions. They create attractor states in your brain, right? And they become very stable. So how could we see differently? It's by engaging the process of creating perception. Well, the first step in that is to not just admit, but embody the fact that everything you do right now is grounded in your assumptions. Not sometimes, but all the time. Because if you don't accept that, then you'll never create the possibility of seeing differently.
In another video, I go into these questions of psychological patterns as developed by C.G. Jung, and also that of persona, for example. So this is very similar to what Beau Lotto is here proposing, is that you have to become aware of these assumptions, you have to become aware of your persona, you have to become aware of how you perceive the world, to start working with that, to questioning those assumptions actively. And I think to a certain degree he's quite right, because that gives you again, a little bit of security and certainty and some sort of process to step into this area of non-assumption. I like also how he said we saw something meaningless and turned it into something meaningful. And that's already this process, what I describe, where I see you confront yourself with the unknown and turn it into something known, and that means meaningful. And meaning, because he references the example with the predator, this is always a very good example that you say, okay, we were sitting in a dark cave, we heard some noises outside, we didn't know what it was. It could be a predator, but it could be also something we could hunt for dinner and survive for the next weeks. And so we have to explore and find out what that is. And through that we develop certain assumptions, how to discriminate the dangerous from the promising. And meaningful in this context also means meaning. What is the meaning for that, what I perceive for the actions I should take? Should I protect myself? Should I run away from that? Should I explore it more? Should I hunt it down? Should I make it useful for my survival? So there's a fairly simple process operating here when it comes to meaning. And you can always say, what does it mean for the action I'm supposed to take?
So much of Deviate, if people walk away with anything, it's knowing the process of perception. In some sense, I want them to know less at the end than they think they know now, because nothing interesting begins with knowing, it begins with not knowing, right? Because the next step is to then identify your assumptions, because most of everything that we do, we don't know why we do what we do. And then the final step is to question those assumptions, okay? But questioning assumptions is incredibly difficult. Because to question assumptions, to doubt what you assume to be true already, especially if that assumption defines who you are, is to do the one thing that our brain evolved to avoid, which is uncertainty.
Again, here he even goes into these assumptions of who we actually are as individuals and what are we made up of. And questioning those assumptions is very difficult, and we just talked about that. But I would like to go a bit further and again raise this question of crisis, of personal crisis, but also organizational crisis, systemic crisis. That is when all these assumptions are being questioned because they don't serve anymore to make meaning, create sense, and deal with the environment as we're facing. It becomes overly chaotic, and then the whole psyche starts to rearrange itself to again be able to make sense of that environment and to create meaning. That's just a side note, because I thought it fits very well in terms of when is it useful to question assumptions, and when does it happen from the moment? Sort of when are we forced to question them? And perhaps one way to not avoid crisis, but to mitigate it or to steer through that a little bit better would be to question these assumptions before the crisis hits us completely, which might not always be possible, but I believe in this way let's say the system or organization and the leadership of the organization stays more flexible, stays more on its feet, is more agile.
In fact, uncertainty is such a difficult, dangerous thing that evolution has created a brain that tries to avoid it altogether, to the extent that we have things like confirmational bias. Well, we'll start looking for evidence to confirm what we assume to be true already. That we would rather hold on to assumptions that we know don't work, because that is safer, we think, than questioning them and stepping into a place that we don't actually know, even though that other place might be a great deal better than where we are.
And so although the other place might be a great deal better than we are right now, still we won't do it because we hold on to our assumptions. This reminded me very much of another video I did. It's called The Myth of the Objective, which I found very interesting, where the idea is that these emergent properties, this emergent future always outperforms the planned future, because the planned future is built on these assumptions. That is actually what management is doing, like management science. If you look at risk management, if you look at strategy, if you look at planning, if you look at strategy mapping, all those things, they build on assumptions of the future, how the future will develop, what competencies we have, what resources we have, and so on and so forth, and what actions we should take to achieve that future. And what I explained in the other video, what then happens is that everything becomes hierarchically organized to achieve that one objective, basically. Okay, so, and that's what you're being taught. There's some sort of alignment going on, there's direction going on. But what happens at the same time, you're depriving yourself of all the other possibilities which might also emerge, but which might not be within that idea of assumptions. So that's a tricky one. So how to get out of that? Like, how do you still, although you have to plan, you have to organize, you have to communicate, you have to think rationally, how do you still stay on your toes to keep that space open for those emergent possibilities outside of your assumptions? That's an interesting one.
Right. This actually exists all the time within politics. It exists within the concept of the negative view of U-turns, where we ridicule politicians for changing their mind because they got new evidence. We want them to hold on to the same path despite the evidence, which actually shifts them more towards a belief as opposed to anything that's evidence-driven.
Yeah, so here he mentions leadership, in this case political leadership, but you could also say administrative or business leadership or anything, because yeah, we don't want to see them doing U-turns or suddenly changing their opinion because we believe then they're not credible anymore. They don't feel themselves bound by their values, although the situation might have shifted. This is a strange phenomena. So like it's almost like a social contract. Okay, so I have to appear competent, stay on message, stay on track, be true to what I promised to do. Although now I see the situation different, I can't get out of that without losing face or credibility on all these things. That's difficult. I would claim, however, that if a person is perceived true to their values, it is also for them possible to do these kinds of U-turns and to explain that also and to justify it and say, I've come now to different conclusions. I don't see it in that particular way anymore. It's just then a question, especially within hierarchies, if such a behavior is tolerated, if that is seen as an actual quality to correct oneself, to admit mistakes, to say, I've clung too long to these assumptions, I've let go of them, I see it now differently, I think this would be a better future. So again, it has a lot to do with culture, our organizational culture. To what degree do we tolerate that within others, within ourselves, and also believe others that now this is the best possible solution for all of us?
So this also then leads on to the idea of whether or not the brain ever does big jumps, or does it only do small steps? And the answer is the brain only ever does small steps. I can only get from here to the other side of the room by passing through the space in between. I can't teleport myself to the other side. Right? Similarly, your brain only ever makes small steps in its ideas. So whenever you're in a moment, it can only actually shift itself to the next most likely possible. And the next most likely possible is determined by its assumptions. We call it the space of possibility. Right? You can't do just anything. Some things are just impossible for you in terms of your perception or in terms of your conception of the world. What's possible is based on your history.
There are two important points he's making here, and I want to take that apart a little bit. The space of possibilities, and then these small steps which you're able to take. And he, in a strange way, we'll see that in the next clip, he sort of like puts that back together, but I'll try to take it apart first. There's always this notion which emerges again and again, like in Gestalt therapy, but also in art, which is this kind of script, so this pathway, or I think also we have that in management science, where there seems to be some sort of incrementalism going on, which means not all pathways are possible. There's a certain range of pathways which are possible, but they are just within that range. Perhaps that's what he means by space of possibility, but I don't think so. What he means is indeed that we are bound by what seems to be possible for us within certain situations, and what assumptions we have about who we are and what we can do and what we can't do. So again, I can't be the CEO of Lufthansa tomorrow, although I might dream of doing that, but it's simply not within that space of possibilities. But with space of possibilities, he means, I think, a little bit something different, and I'll comment on that. And I find that very interesting. Also that he, again, comments on this question of history. So where have I been in the past? Where am I now? What future can I envision? So all these logic incremental steps which my brain can take. But on the other hand, there seems to be some sort of other structure which he's referring to, which is this space of possibilities. And we'll go into that now, because I think that's really very interesting, how then creativity or also artists start to work within that space of possibilities.
Right. So what that means is, where does that leave us with creativity, which we have this concept that you're linking two things that are very far apart. But if the brain never does big jumps, what's really happening? And the idea is that for the person being creative, all they're doing is making a small step to the next most likely possibility based on their assumptions. But when someone on the outside sees them doing that, they think, wow, how did they put those two things that are far apart together? And the reason why it seems that way is because for the observer, they are far apart. They have a different space of possibility. And in their space of possibility, they exist way over here. So creativity in this sense is only created from the outside, not from the inside. For the person being creative, they're making a logical next step. The difference is that their space of possibility is different. They have different assumptions, different biases. In fact, they might have a more complex space of possibility because they have more complex biases and assumptions. Maybe they had a more open attitude to when they experienced other cultures, etc., and they assimilated more complex assumptions. So they have more directions in which they can move within their space of possibility.
So his definition is interesting, although I don't quite agree with the idea of that this is logical, because logical would mean some sort of connection. And I'm just going to open this up a little bit. Jung talks of the introvert having this interior landscape or this interior imagery the introvert then is referring to, and starts using that to make sense of the outside world. This is what I would call the space of possibilities. Like, it's not that the person the artist or this creative person is using rational logic mechanisms to figure out what to do next and has more of these rational logic points in their, let's say, memory or in their skill set, and then connects these to come up with a solution. It is usually quite different if you ask artists. It doesn't show up immediately why that first response to a situation really makes sense. It just seems to make sense later, at a later stage. So, for example, if you have a very rich interior landscape, an imagery sort of emerges in response to a problem, you might refer to that imagery and say, well, perhaps I need to talk now to this person, or I need to take that action. But it doesn't seem at first to be connected to that problem, because it's connected within that internal landscape to each other, and then you will find out somehow it does refer back to that problem. I thought of a different example, which is maybe more of substance. Let's say you're at a conference, and the conference has a certain subject matter, and perhaps you even went to the conference because the subject matter of it is of interest. But as we all know, or it's well known phenomena, that the most interesting things happen in the coffee breaks or at the lunch breaks. That's where you meet then those people who seem to have some sort of answer to a problem you're working on, or they have this is a promising contact for a project you're pursuing. So you could see basically what you could see is that all the attendance of this conference is that space of possibilities, where is being formally discussed is the rational deliberation. But the whole, let's say, substructure of the space of possibilities is all these people with all these minds, with all these histories, wandering about within that conference, going for coffee and lunch breaks, or going out in the evening for a drink, and mixing and mingling. And that's where you start exploring, and that's where you start to find certain promising solutions for the problems you're working on. So and this openness, to have that openness for that happening, because you're not consciously pursuing to meet that person. Well, maybe you are, but in most cases, it's more almost like a chance meeting. You're open to the possibility of meeting somebody new and strange, and you haven't talked to that person before. Suddenly you're sitting in front of them and you have this really engaging conversation. So on one hand, and that's I think why the conference is a good analogy, you are stepping into the space of certainty and uncertainty at the same time. The certainty is you have your conference program that sets you at ease. You say, okay, I know what's going on. I know what the agenda is. It's high quality presentations, really factually well vetted papers, and also, quite stimulating and all this. But where the uncertainty happens is, what kind of people are you going to meet? What kind of discussions are you going to have? What sort of dialogue will unfold? And also you have that willingness to step into that space of uncertainty without perhaps even knowing it or being aware of that. So I think that uncertainty works quite well if you talk about the space of possibilities. It's all which is going on during the conference apart from the formal setting.
Right. So we interpret that as them being creative by linking things that are far apart. But in fact, it's a logical process of making small steps, changing your space of possibility by identifying and then questioning your assumptions.
Yeah, so you link things which are perceived from outside as far apart, but for you it's actually not such a big deal. Okay, so if you come back from that conference with a new idea how to solve your project, people will say, well, how did he do it? For you, it wasn't such a big deal. And for an artist to link certain ideas within that space of possibilities, within that imagery which is coming up within them, where they start to explore that option or talk to this person or express themselves in this way, they have already trained themselves for that process, that they believe, well, I don't know exactly why I'm doing this, why I'm using this color, or why I'm now expressing myself with this musical note, but it's more or less linked within that landscape to that problem outside. So that's how you have to say it. It's like an internal journey which addresses an outside problem. And so that's why I think this work of Beau Lotto is really very interesting, because of that term space of possibilities. It links very nicely to the idea of an internal landscape. Also the work of Ian McGilchrist, as you remember, where he says how we view the world is first presented in its wholeness and also within imageries and metaphor. And then only after that we start to rationalize it and put it into words. So this process is actually within all human beings, perhaps more prevalent in artists. And it is a process which is extremely important for leadership to become aware of that, to train that, to identify also the talent. So those people who can, let's say, work with that paradoxical state of mind, where on one hand they have to work according to certain skills and competencies, but are also able then to question these in appropriate times. So switching basically from one mode into another, and be willing also to do that again and again, to question themselves, to step into that space of possibilities. So thanks a lot for listening and viewing this video. I hope you enjoyed it a little bit. I think it really links up to a lot of other videos I've been doing on psychology, on art and leadership, and see you in the next video.